Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Keystone Kickoff Show. I'm Jim Galanti, along with Chris Buchignani, co-host of the Obligatory Pregame Show and For the Bloggy contributor. Chris, this past week, you created a very nice article talking about the recruiting in the state of Florida specifically, because there's this narrative about Penn State dipping into the Florida recruiting, and is it worth it? Is it worth putting the time and the resources into going so far away to bring players in if they're just going to leave anyway? Tell us what you found out.
Yeah, well, I wish we were coming together under better circumstances, Jim, because I think you and I both agree it's a little heartbreaking to lose a great young prospect like Fort Lauderdale's King Mack, who jumped in the transfer portal. I do just want to make a note. I think it's remarkable that we're about 5 years into the transfer portal era. And when you look back at the players who have left Penn State and the ones who have stayed, it's taken this long for us to be talking about a true heartbreaker of a guy we think can be a legit player jumping in the portal. I think James Franklin has done a very commendable job keeping the best players at Penn State and letting the guys who are less likely to see the field move on. So, yeah, I saw that news and it made me very, very sad because I had very high hopes for King this season and beyond. And my first thought was, there goes another Florida kid. Why do we even bother spending the time and effort to bring these kids to campus when they just leave? But I always like to interrogate the narrative, and I thought, well, let's dive into it. Let's look at where Penn State's pulling their recruits from. Let's look at the Florida kids in particular and see whether this narrative that I know is out there, like it was in my head, I've talked to other people about it, that we don't do a good job retaining Florida recruits, and just see how much merit there is to it. So I went back and I looked at all of James Franklin's recruiting classes, the 11 since he stepped on campus now, including the recently signed 2024 class, 254 kids overall, and 17 of them hailing from Florida. A quick caveat that does include players from the IMG Academy, that's like a hotbed talent factory in the state of Florida, may have gotten there from other places. But when you look at how the recruiting services credit talent and where it's sourced, they consider them Florida recruits. So for the purposes of this exercise, we'll include guys like KJ Hamler and Katron Allen as Florida recruits. So that's 17 overall. Since 2014, 8 of whom have left. If we throw out Michael O'Connor from the class of 2014, a Canadian kid from IMG, Bill O'Brien recruited him, and then we take out King Mack, who we just talked about, that means we're looking at 6 guys, all of them, Jim, clustered between the recruiting classes of 2020 and 2018. And what I saw when I actually looked at that list of players is that, yeah, they were Florida guys, but by and large, there were mitigating factors on almost every single one of them. So just to give you those 6 guys, it was defensive tackle Judge Culpepper, wide receivers John Dunmore and TJ Jones, and running backs Noah King, Keziah Holmes, and Kevon Lee. And I think one of the most remarkable things when I read that list to you, Jim, is how many of those names pop out at you as players who were truly missed after they left Happy Valley.
None of them. You don't look at them and say, boy, I wish they had stayed. They would have been difference makers.
Yeah, and to talk about each individually, Judge was a guy who came in with a lot of hype, and he's a 4-star recruit, NFL bloodlines, maybe just not quite quick enough, not quite big enough to make an impact on a Big Ten defensive line. He was in a room with a lot of other talented players. He was not going to see a lot of snaps. And shout out to him. He became a Toledo Rocket, won a MAC championship, and I think made the decision that he wanted to go to a school where he was maybe playing a different caliber of football, but one where he was going to get on the field a lot. And he did when he made the transfer. The 2 wide receivers, after they left Penn State, have really not made any impact to speak of. There are no Nittany Lions fans looking at TJ Jones or John Dunmore, who, by the way, I missed on. I thought he was going to be a player. Neither one of those guys is missed by Penn State fans. And then the 3 running backs, Noah Cain and Kevon Lee especially, those guys made important contributions to the program while they were here. And for various reasons, Noah had some real struggles coming back from injury. Holmes and Kevon Lee end up falling behind underclassmen on the depth chart. Penn State, as we all know, does a killer job on the recruiting trail at the tailback position year in and year out. And what that means is if you come in and you are a recruit who is merely very, very good, the odds are that there's going to be an underclassman who is great or better coming in a class or two behind you. And that's what happened with those two guys. And so, yeah, they made contributions, but I don't think there are any Penn State fans who would look at either one of those backs and say, man, I would rather have him on the field than Nick Singleton or Katron Allen, right? And so when you're talking about such a small sample size of recruits, when you get down to the individual level and you look at why did they stay or why did they go, all of a sudden the distance, the culture shock, the climate, all of those things that you think might be impacting a Florida recruit, yeah, maybe that's one factor, but I don't think it's the motivating factor. I don't think it's the most important. And then when I talk about some of the Florida kids who stayed, our first Florida recruit, a James Franklin guy out of Tampa, Amani Oruwariye, a starter at defensive back for multiple years. God bless him, ended the App State game and saved us from lifelong embarrassment, went on to play in the NFL. KJ Hamler, an IMG kid, great career at Penn State and still hanging on in the NFL. Buffalo Bills fans hoping he can turn it around. But really what I think the big headline is if you are somebody who thought Penn State's wasting its time going down into the Sunshine State recruiting talent, is that ultimate judgment is yet to be rendered because there are a total now of 6 guys on the current roster with Florida roots. We talked about Katron Allen, but I'm going to name some other young guys who are going to be critical to Penn State in 2024. 2 defensive backs, Cam Miller from the class of 2022 and Elliott Washington from 23, and another class of 2022 guy, a defensive tackle, Zane Durant. Now, Miller and Washington, who I like a lot, they're going to be called upon immediately to contribute and help replenish Penn State's defensive backfield this year. And Zane, although he's not going to be required to play a lot, I think has a very, very high ceiling. And if he gets anywhere close to it, he's going to factor in big time in the tackle rotation. And I think his ceiling could be game-changing player for Penn State. And then there are, we lost King Mack, 2 other 2024 defensive backs, Antoine Belgrave Shorter and John Mitchell. Jury is out on those guys. They most likely will not be playing this year. We don't want them to be playing because it probably means there were injuries in the secondary. So I think when you look at it, you say, man, if those guys I just talked about, if they continue to progress and they impact the program, that turns the narrative that Penn State's wasting its time in Florida on a dime. So really, if you're somebody who has felt like Penn State might do better allocating time and resources recruiting somewhere else, my message to you ultimately is watch those Florida players on the current roster now, because that determines which way the narrative ultimately goes.
My couple takeaways from this, Chris, are, first of all, it's not that they're being recruited for Florida, it's how good are you in evaluating. And most recently, when you have a Cam Miller, a Zane Durant, a Katron Allen, oh yeah, it's worth going into Florida to bring those guys in. So it feels like the biggest variable is not that they're from Florida, it's the level of talent, which leads me to wonder, how do the numbers compare for Florida compared to the other remote locations that Penn State brings players in?
Yeah, sure. So just interestingly, I broke down different regions where Penn State is sourcing its talent since James Franklin has come to campus. Pennsylvania is the #1 source of recruits for Penn State, which is awesome. If we're not dominating the state, we're close. And the attrition rate is also the lowest. Only 28% of the Pennsylvania-based recruits have left Penn State in the Franklin era. So then you look at the other areas, the South minus Florida. So that's everywhere else in the SEC footprint, to include Texas now, of course, has actually a relatively low attrition rate, 35%. But again, 17 recruits out of Florida, 17 recruits out of the South otherwise. small sample size. There's going to be some noise there. And as I discussed, the devil's in the details. You really got to look at on an individual basis, why did the player stay or why did he go? Another great talent region for Penn State is the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia. Penn State's pulled a lot of players out of there and has had only a 38% attrition rate. New York, New Jersey, Delaware, a source of a lot of great players for Penn State, a 32% attrition rate. And then again, you do look at New England, the New England states, not a lot of players, 14, but a 57% rate of players leaving campus before they finish their time or get their degree. And the Midwest is right around 48%. Now, the average for the program overall, since James has gotten here, stopping at the 2021 class, has been 50%. None of the other class, obviously, we haven't had anyone leave from 24 yet, thankfully. And neither 2022 or 2023 has had more than 9% of the players leave. Now, that'll obviously change till all is said and done. But 50% is about the average across all the classes, all the regions. So, yeah, if you look at it, distance probably is a factor. I don't think in almost any case it's the determining factor. And there's nothing to me that suggests Penn State shouldn't continue on its current strategy of killing it in the regional recruiting footprint, but continuing to recruit talent nationally.
All right, Chris, my takeaway from all of this is if they're talented and getting on the field, they typically stick around.
If you play, you stay, and if you don't, you go.
Exactly. All right. Thank you all for listening. That is it for this edition of the Keystone Kickoff Show. Make sure you join us next time.